I'm starting a new chapter today, Models in Economics, and that has some continuity with the previous chapter, with Friedman's theory about the methodology of positive economics. What one can learn from Friedman is that usually economic models, he doesn't call them models, that way of speaking came up later. Earlier people spoke about theories, laws and hypotheses, and Friedman shows us that in many of these economic hypotheses we are using, abstractions, idealizations and substitutions may take place. And he does that in the language of the 50s, explaining that, how that works. So one should not be surprised that in economic models, as we would say today, in economic models there are assumptions, scare quote assumptions, meaning that there are elements that are manifestly false because they are substitutions, idealizations and abstractions. This is in today's discussion in general philosophy of science concerning models. This is commonplace. Everyone knows there in this discussion that you have in models wherever you use them, whether it's economics or climate or COVID or physics or whatever. I mean, models are everywhere, or sociology, or even history. Wherever you use them, you always use abstractions and idealizations. This is absolute commonplace. So it's somehow surprising, I think, that this aspect of Friedman's work has not been seen clearly, more clearly, because in a sense it's obvious, I think. Anyway, so, well, that's a different story. The point is now, we learned these elements from Friedman. We may have learned that from Friedman, that in these models, hypotheses, etc., in economics, there are these unrealistic assumptions, namely, as I said, abstractions, idealization, etc. And the question that is now coming up is, how is it possible that such entities, such hypotheses and theories are explanatory for real-life phenomena? Friedman gave us a particular explanation. He said, you know, these abstractions and idealizations pick out the most relevant factors for certain phenomena. Those things that are the causal factors that drive a certain phenomena or give it its particular shape. So this was plausible. Now we are coming to models that are even more abstract, because that's also a process that has increased in the last 50 or 80 years probably, that the models that economists are building become more and more abstract. And in philosophy of economics, methodology of economics, for some 30 years now, there has been a discussion about the possible ways how these very abstract models can do explanatory work for the real world. And this is something, when you as an economist, you get used to these models and you work with them and you do your explanations and everything works fine, and your colleagues see that, yeah, that's explanatory, blah, 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 all fine. But the point is, once you start thinking about it, I mean, damn it, how is it possible that these very abstract, very abstract, we see examples today, how is it possible that they have an explanatory value for real-life phenomena? So this is a typical thing where philosophy may come in. You have a certain practice. The practice works, usually works. But once you start thinking about it, then you say, well, I don't really understand what's going on. And if you then say, oh, but it would be interesting to understand a little more and in more detail what is really going on there, then you may become curious, and then you often move away from the practice of the respective science or whatever the practice is, and then you move into philosophy, and perhaps you learn something which may not be utterly useful for your practice, but what you gain is some sort of understanding. Right? You then may say, oh, I understand the practice now better. I'm not improving my practice, but I'm improving my understanding of the practice. And if you're not only interested in just, doing the practice, but also say, yeah, but I want to understand a little more, then you are sometimes naturally driven to philosophy. And sometimes philosophy delivers then some sort of understanding. So this is the aim here. And because this is one of the core problems discussed in philosophy of economics, these models, because as I told you earlier, and it's not my idea, that models are, that economics is the science of models. I mean, climatology is also a science of models. I mean, climatology only have models. But in the realm of the social sciences, it's really very, very strongly economics. I mean, also sociologists have models, psychologists have models, so agent-based models in sociology are very common. And also we will see one model I'm discussing today is also used in sociology, and it's interesting, very interesting, that although sociologists and economists sometimes use very similar model, they don't seem to talk to each other. I was once invited at a conference about prediction and explanation, and then there were sociologists and economists, and then I asked the sociologists whether they talk with their models, agent-based models, to the economists who use very similar models. They said no, there doesn't seem to be much, well, that's only anecdotal evidence, but that there may be something like a gap between the sociologists and economists. Probably none of your professors has encouraged you to make contact with the sociologists and say, yeah, you should also study sociology if you want to be a good economist. No, economics thinks, no, we are autonomous. We don't need those sociologists. They don't use game theory. They don't use models in the way we use them, which is partly false. Anyway, so but that happens all the time, that different disciplines don't have the contact that, if you look at it as an outsider, you think that might be a useful contact, and sometimes they don't do that for historical, whatever reasons, psychological, perhaps sociological, biological, I don't know what it is. Okay, so we come to the models in economics. Here's the outline. First, a little literature. Then I present one of the most important papers in that discussion of the last 2 decades, Sugden 2000. Then I have critical comments on Sugden 2000. And because the critical comments are very critical, I think it's necessary to have an alternative approach, and I'll present that. That alternative approach is not being published. I presented it at some conferences, was never really destroyed. But it's still waiting for publication. Okay, so here's that's the central text. Credible Worlds, the Status of Theoretical Models in Economics, Journal of Economic Methodology. This is one of the 2 main journals here in the philosophy of economics. It has 630 plus Google citations, which is a lot for methodology paper. So it's really a much discussed paper. Sugden is, well, I say more to him, he's a real economist, so he's not really just flying around in philosophy. Here are supplementary texts. Sugden has then written a few more things and gave talks on that subject. Credible Worlds, Capacities and Mechanisms in Erkenntnis in 2009, and then 2013, how fictional accounts can explain. Here the word term fictional appears because these models are so abstract that they look like fictions, right? Or you just dream them up. You'll see that in a moment. And then Akerlof, that's one of the models we are discussing, but only shortly. The Market for Lemons, Quality, Uncertainty, and the Market Mechanism, Quarterly Journal of Economics. Probably know that this is one of the top 5 journals. Akerlof is Nobel equivalent in economics he got. Then Gruinianov, and I've got an older paper here in the syllabus. I've replaced it by a paper from 21. Gruinianov and a French postdoc. And that's even the better paper, but concerning this, what I'm going to say, learning from minimal economic models, they are sometimes called minimal models. Then Julian Rice, a paper that made quite some impact on the discussion, the explanation paradox, because he says there is a paradox if you look at it, that explanations must somehow refer to true premises. Right? You cannot explain something by something untrue, right? By a lie or so. That can't explain it. But I mean, models are not true of the world. I mean, they are lies in a sense, or caricatures. So how is it possible that these models explain? And he calls that the explanation paradox, and many people discuss that. And then Schelling, this is also one of the models. We'll discuss it in more detail, dynamic models of segregation. Also Schelling, one of the Nobel-winning, also an extremely influential paper, the Schelling paper, and we'll discuss it, and I use it as my exemplar for models in this lecture. Okay. So we start with I present to you Sugden, the paper, first Sugden, he's a professor of economics, he's really an economist, one of the few economists really then talking to the philosophers and methodologists, but he's really an economist in University of East Anglia, 40,000 Google citations, which is quite good, which is really, I mean, the top people, Ernst Fair is 130,000 or so, but this is, you know, somewhere else. But this is very good. So he seems to be a really established economist. His most important publication is Regret Theory and Alternative Theory of Rational Choice. The Economic Journal in 82, 4,900 citation. That's really good for an economist. So if you think you make a career in economics, well, 5,000 citations for your best paper, not bad. But you know, the guy is a little older, so it's very important in science and philosophy that you become old, because then you can see more and more people cite your stuff, and it's cumulative. It's strictly cumulative. These numbers are strictly cumulative. Other things concerning reputation are not cumulative, but citations are cumulative. That's wonderful. And Google counts them for you. You don't have to do anything. All right. So the outline of his paper is, I hope you have read the paper. It's one of the central papers. This is the outline, introduction, then Akerlof and the market for lemons, and Schelling's checkerboard model of racial sorting. These are the two models, the two models that Sugden investigates. It's the Akerlof model and Schelling model, and they are beyond doubt important models in economics. Just absolutely no doubt, no controversy. And then he discusses various ways how you can understand, or that were proposed in the literature, how these abstract models do their explanatory work. One was their conceptual exploration, another one was instrumentalism, another one was metaphor and caricature, and another one was economics as an inexact deductive science and the method of isolation, whatever that means. These are just the titles of the sections. And then comes Sugden to his own theory. He speaks about inductive inference. He thinks that all what's in the literature in 2000, by 2000 is wrong. And he says, no, my way is different. And what we have to talk about is inductive inference. The point is inductive inference. And then the induction, you know, we have these problems of induction. You have to justify that it's really possible. And then he says, yeah, they're just justifying induction separability, justifying induction robustness, and then justifying induction credible worth. So there are 3 steps somehow to justify that, and then the conclusion. So you see that the paper has really a composition. So it's not just, you know, associative, but he really knows what he's doing. Well, good economists usually know what they're doing. Well, very good philosophers also know usually what they're doing. The very good ones. Okay. Now, all right. So now I'm going to present Sugden's paper. I go rather quickly through it. And the question is, of course, do economic models really help to understand the real world? The real world is meant in contrast to a model world. Right? You have a model world in which you have certain entities, certain stuff that is moving or whatever it's doing, and we have the real world. And then the question is, hey, do they help these models understand the real world? Critics of economics and from outside or even possibly from inside say that models are abstract, unrealistic, and they do not lead to clearly testable hypotheses. And all what you could see in the financial crisis, the last one from 2009 and the following years, I mean, one of the main things that you found in newspapers, yeah, these economists rely on models, they don't understand their models themselves, they're very abstract, and then they are surprised when the models don't do good work, and we shouldn't be surprised because, you know, they work around with these models and don't know what they're doing, and it's not a very serious science. So this was really quite in the air after 2009, and this is also something that Sugden refers to. And the real question is, how can they tell something true about the real world? How is that possible? It's not doubting, well, some people doubt it, but normal economists don't doubt it, but the question is, how does it really work? And the illustration that Sugden gives us is 2 famous papers, Akerlof's Market for Lemons and Schelling's Model of Segregation, and they are really interesting papers. I think I have them in the in OLAT that you can read them. These are really, I mean, this is top work in economics. So it's always very important to read the best stuff in any discipline. Read the best stuff. There you see how the really good people work, how they think, and how they write good papers. So the first one is Akerlof and the Market for Lemons. Lemons, you may not know that, I didn't know it, I had to look it up, is the American slang word for bad used cars. Right? So we have a used car, we have a market for new cars, and there is a market for used cars, and bad used cars are in American dialect are called lemons. And the question is there a market for lemons? And there's an interesting phenomenon that Akerlof investigated. Akerlof introduced the concept of asymmetric information into economics. I mean, you may be aware that in most models that you use in neoclassical economics, you assume certain things, and one of the things you usually assume is full information. Right? So these people who have to choose have full information about the alternatives and all the properties of the different choices. And this is one of the very, very widely used assumptions in economics. And then Akerlof was the first one who then introduced the concept of asymmetric information, showing that there are certain situations in which it is economically relevant that some people know different things or know more than other people who are in that market. So, and this is an important paper with an astonishingly many promised applications in the real world. He says what he's describing there has many, many applications. Okay. It has 39,000 Google citations in February 22. So this is really absolute top. I mean, this is almost unbelievable. But this is, well, that's 50 years old, and it's good to have that paper, and it's still around. Okay. So what he does in the paper is he presents a highly unrealistic model of the used car market that supposedly explains why the price of slightly used cars is significantly lower than the price of new cars. So this comes out, he describes it somewhere, that he had with colleagues over a beer or whatever, a wine. They had a discussion. Why is it that once you bought a car and 1 week after you try to sell it, the car has lost something like 25% of its value? And the question is, and the usual thing was then they gave some sort of psychological explanations. You know, usually they say, yeah, people want to have, you know, a new car, it's very special. But Akerlof said, that is not can't be that he wasn't satisfied with that sort of explanation. And he said, there must be a better explanation in economic terms, right? I mean, this ideal that whether the car has 10 kilometers or 100 kilometers and that makes a difference in value is completely irrational. I mean, the car doesn't get worse by 100 kilometers. Even at that time in 1970s, when American cars probably did 80,000 miles or so until they broke down. And also a Mercedes was after 100,000 kilometers, you had to replace the engine. But anyway, so it looks completely irrational. And when economists see something completely irrational, they usually say, well, wait a minute, where are the incentives? What's the market situation? Blah, blah, blah. And then he said, well, there is a situation of asymmetric information. That's the fantastic point here. And well, basically, it's such, the paper goes like that. The asymmetry is that the owners know whether their car is a lemon or not, whether it's a good car or not. But the buyers of the second-hand cars don't know it. So what you have the situation that as a buyer, you want to buy a car that's 2 weeks old or 1 week old. You don't know what sort of car is on the market. But you must assume it's a lemon, right? And then you only pay what it would be worth to pay for a lemon, right? So that's the idea. So the asymmetric information is there between the sellers and the buyers. And what he shows that in a highly unrealistic models, that under certain circumstances, there won't be a market for lemons because of that asymmetric information. It shows that even those cars who are good used cars will not be sold because the buyers don't know it, that this particular one is a good one or whether it's a lemon. And because the danger is it's a lemon, they can't give it back, then they don't buy anything. So that's a very important part of the paper. It's really interesting, and it opened a new subspecialty of economics with asymmetric information. So there are no direct comments on real markets and no attempts to test the model. This is what Sugden rightly observes. He says, that's a funny paper, isn't it? A highly unrealistic model, and which he mostly shows, well, there will be no market, no one will sell, no one will buy these cars. The reason being asymmetric information. And as Sugden rightly comments, from a Popperian perspective, where I have to test everything, blah, 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 falsify, the story, that looks like pseudoscience. I mean, they're really doing something and telling you stories, and no one's really trying to test that. And that is the hallmark of pseudoscience from a Popperian point of view. So this is something where, and the paper is very well written, I think, Sugden's paper, and this is that brings the problem to the fore, that you say, wait a minute, I mean, this is really an interesting story that that Akerlof is telling, but it's highly abstract, and how is he going about to sell that to his fellow economists as a piece of economic science? And then you say, well, that looks very strange. I mean, no testing, nothing specific, just a story in this way. So how does that work? Okay. What kind of scientific reasoning is this? This is Sugden's question. Okay. The second example is Schelling's checkerboard model of racial sorting. Who is familiar with Akerlof's model? Have you heard that already in economics? You've heard that in standard classes in undergraduate. And the Schelling's checkerboard model, who is familiar with that? You also heard it in special, no? In microeconomics probably? At YouTube, okay. Oh, so your own initiative. Well, it's not the worst idea to have initiative yourself as student. Really, you do not get everything at the university. Okay, you find a good presentation of the model, apparently in YouTube. Yeah, okay, wonderful. Okay, by the way, there is a very twisted history of Schelling's original paper, and Rainer Hexelmann has written a paper of 150 pages. Thomas Schelling and James Sarkoda, the intellectual, technical, and social history of a model. The point is that it is really Sarkoda who brought up this model. He published it earlier, and Schelling published something later, but Sarkoda got completely forgotten and ended up as something. He didn't end up as a famous economist, but did something else. So this is a very strange story. If you want to see how real science sometimes works, this is very interesting. So Hexelmann worked for years on that paper, trying to get all the pieces together. And it's a fantastic story, but you see sometimes you think science is a madhouse. I mean, if you look at that story, that Sarkoda doesn't get anything, Schelling gets a Nobel, and they say, wait a minute, this is not a really good enterprise. Anyway, but that happens from time to time. I guess it's not the average situation, but it happens sometimes, and then it's a little disturbing. And it's an example from evolutionary game theory. It concerns a classic theme of economics, and I preached you that several times, the unintended consequences of uncoordinated individual actions. So I would add here the aggregation of the unintended consequences. So this is really in the social sciences, and especially in economics, this is the main topic you investigate, the aggregation of the unintended consequences of, and here he has a very good adjective here, uncoordinated individual actions. So people do more or less the same thing, but not because of coordination, but because there may be the same incentives, right? So they do something, and then that has side effects and unintended side effects, and when you aggregate them, you get a phenomenon where you say, what the hell is happening here? I don't understand a word, right? So this example I will work out then. The result of the model is that mild individual racial preferences may produce sharp segregation on the social level. So people not really being hard racists, but just being, now using examples here from this class, say Europeans who may have slight prejudices against Asians, or the other way around. Everything happens in the world. And that has, if very many people have that, and there may be very slight, these prejudices, you just feel a little more comfortable with someone from the same it's not racist. That's nonsense. They're not racist. That's ethnicities or whatever. Anyway, so you have you feel slightly more comfortable, and that very slight preference may lead, when aggregated under certain conditions, to very strong segregation. And that was really surprising in the 1970s. The normal thing is, when you see segregation, what you assume is, yeah, they're just they're just racists, right? And therefore they're separate. But the point is, so you assume when you see some segregation somewhere, you say, yeah, they're all racist, damn it. But it may not be the case. It may be very, very soft in a way that seems socially or morally acceptable, that you just feel, when you're somewhere and then you don't know anybody, you don't understand what's going on, and then you see someone who looks similar to you, speaks the same language, and then you feel, oh, this is comfortable, right? So I'm rather with him or her instead of them, right? You may not be a racist for that, but just feel a little more comfortable. But the aggregated effect of something like that may be horrendous. And this is why this so-called Schelling model had such an effect. Mild individual racial preferences may produce sharp segregation on the social level. Okay? The standard, so to speak, Schelling model consists of an 8x8 grid of squares randomly filled with white and black chips and some empty spaces as initial condition. Now you wonder, why is this here empty? Well, of course, I show you here. It looks like that. So that's the standard model. You start with that. The chips are randomly assigned there, and there are some empty spaces. And then you add some dynamics. And the dynamics of the model consists of moving pieces that are surrounded by only 1 or 2 pieces out of 8 of the same color to the nearest empty square that is surrounded by at least 3 pieces of the same color. So you have 8 neighbors, right? And if you have only 1 or 2 of the same color, then you move away and you move somewhere where you have at least 3 of the same color. This is a mild preference, all right? It's not that, for instance, a hard preference would be as soon as you have 1 neighbor of the other color, you immediately move away and only want to be surrounded by people of the same color. But it's very soft here. It's very mild. That's the dynamics here. And this is called the mild racial preferences. And the dynamics, so if you do that, so if you move every piece according to this rule, then the dynamics will stop at some point, the final state, and displaying a sharp segregation. So this is a typical pattern that arises from there where you have all the blacks sitting together, at least in 2 areas there, and the whites sitting more or less together with empty space there. And here's a more dramatic example, a dynamic example, a bigger one. So it starts here, you've got to look at it several times. 1, it starts from 1 to 28, and it starts completely randomly here. It's completely random. And then after 24 steps, we have absolutely sharp segregation. And as I said, the dynamics is very mild. You only move away when you have less than 3 people surrounding you. So if only that. So if you have 3 white neighbors and 8 minus 3 is 5, and 5 black, you stay, right? So you're not a racist. I mean, you have 5 black neighbors, you're happy. But only if it's only 2 whites and 6 black, I'd rather go somewhere else, right? So, and this is the interesting effect. You have this very, very mild racial, or whatever preference, and you get this sharp separation. And that is, you can understand the story that you really say that how Sugden describes it, and that's absolutely right. That this is uncoordinated action of individuals. They don't talk, they don't say that or coordinate their actions. They just have these slight preferences, but the aggregated effect on the macro level is sharp segregation, right? Something where I say, well, that's amazing, isn't it, right? Okay, so this model somehow explains how sharp segregation may emerge out of mild preferences, and this was really the surprise for many people at the time. And also what Akerlof says and Sugden then repeats, it seems applicable for many situations of two homogeneous recognizable groups, men and women, black and white, student and faculty, blue collar, white collar workers, surfers and swimmers, the well-dressed and the purely dressed. Wherever you have an undefined situation, say in a restaurant or in a mensa or whatever it is, and even if you look at yourself, where do I sit, where I feel there is something, a slight preferences, not a racist by that or anything or you're disrespecting the other people. You just feel a little more comfortable there, right? And the effect is sharp segregation, funnily enough, right? And this is, of course, a very interesting insight, and also many explanations, not only so-called racial separation. I'm saying the concept of race is very critical here, because in a biological sense, people with different skin color are not different races, as we don't speak about people who are above 180 is a different race than those below 180. You can't just pick any single attribute of a species and then say everyone who has that is a race and the other is not a race. The biological race concept is much more stringent and has many different connotations. And for humans, we talk about these races, but in a biological sense, they are not races. And the argument is not that they overlap. Right? This is also one of the arguments. That's a bad argument, that races overlap. It's not a counter-argument against the concept of race. But the point is simply you can't take just any arbitrary thing. We don't speak about races of blonde people versus brunette or black-haired people. They're not races. Nobody says that. Right? It would be absurd. And skin color is similar, like hair color, or the length of your big toe. I mean, those with the long big toe are not a different race than those with a short big toe. So you can't simply put, because race has so many connotations, and therefore it's not really racist. Well, this is the common, this is how we speak. We speak about different races, therefore about racism and all that. Okay. All right. So the question is, how exactly such an extremely abstract and counterfactual models, like Schelling's model, on this plate there, can perform the task of explaining real-world phenomena. Somehow, I mean, when you look at it, it's immediately plausible, right? You say, yes, I see that in the Mensa, then more women sit together than men, or somewhere you have some aggregation of people, and then they have to distribute, and then you see, that the more women sit together and more men sit together. Are they either homosexuals or homophobic? No, homosexuals or just hating the other, whatever. No, it's just, if you have a choice, then you just feel a little more comfortable, and then you do it, and then the effect is segregation, right? So it seems to be that we immediately understand what the model does for us, right? You say, oh yes, I know the phenomenon. Oh, now I can understand, many phenomena, last wedding of my uncle or whatever, or my brother, and then I saw how people distribute. Oh, mild preferences may be there for gender or sex. All right, so it seems to be we understand that, but the question really is when you step back and say, wait a minute, how does this work? I mean, we are playing with chips here, and that playing around with chips shall explain what happens in real life. That's a little funny, right? And I want to better understand how that works. Okay. And also what Sugden is pressing here, rightly so, neither Akerlof's nor Schelling's model present testable hypotheses. They never write up a hypothesis where they say, we should test that now. And I mean, usually in empirical science, as economics is supposed to be one, you say, and if you look at it, at least you can try that at a Popperian perspective, then sooner or later you want to have testable hypotheses and you want to run tests in order to eliminate those who are wrong empirically, right? But you don't make an attempt at here. And there Sugden says, wait a minute, what sort of science is this, right? And he's right, because this is really an interesting question.